this video, I'm going to show you how to make block 15. This is actually two separate blocks sewn as triangles and then sewn together to make the square. So the side I am going to show you is side 15A, or sorry, 15-1, and then this is 15-2. They are constructed identically. The only difference is the quilting will be a little bit different in the orange areas in the center. So let's get started and see what we need to make this block. Alright, to get started, to make block 15-1, which is this half of the block, you are going to need some fabric for your flange. That would be some of your fabric 5, and again this is going to be cut 1 1/4 inches wide on the bias of your fabric and then folded in half lengthwise and pressed to form your flange or piping, or I think I call it a flange. You will also need embroidery bobbin thread, water soluble thread. You will need various other colors of thread, and it's all written in your instructions. And if you are putting the backing fabric on the back of your block while it's in the hoop, you will also need your backing fabric and matching bobbins for each of these threads. So let me put these aside. You will also need a square of fabric 4. You will need a strip of fabric 1 or fabric 2, depending on if you're doing block 15-1 or block 15-2. And you will need a larger piece of fabric 7, which is basically our background fabric for this quilt. And you will also need, this is optional, you don't have to do it, but if you're stitching yours with wool, you will cut your wool right on the diagonal. You cut it the square, the size we tell you to, just like all our other blocks, but then you're going to cut it on the diagonal and also press in the edges of all 3 sides. And to get started, we are going to hoop our battleizer, which I've already done, and the machine is going to sew a placement stitch right here so we can add everything else we need for our block. So let's get started. For step 1, we have our battleizer in the hoop and our water soluble thread in the needle and an embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin. So I'm going to just hit the start button and it will sew a placement stitch, so we know where to put our next piece of fabric or our wool if that's what you decide to use. So step 2 is where we're going to add our optional wool that we have pressed around the edges. This is an optional step. You can skip to step 3 if you chose not to use it, but I'm going to use it so I can show you how. So you're just gonna, that placement stitch that just sewed out, you're just gonna lay your wool right inside that area and still have the water soluble thread in the needle, and it'll sew up a zigzag stitch on the outside of the wool to attach it to the battleizer. Step 3, we're going to sew the pattern onto the wool or onto the battleizer if you're not using wool. I'm still using water soluble thread. And the only thing you need to do as it's stitching is you need to press the wool down in front of the foot as it stitches. You can also raise your presser foot to its highest position, and that'll help avoid the foot getting caught in the wool. Step 4, I'm going to add my fabric 7 to our block, and this is basically our background fabric. I still have water soluble thread in the needle, and you're just going to put it right sides up, and there is a long diagonal line here inside the block. I'm going to make it so it extends about 1/4 inch past that, and both on the top and bottom, make sure that you have about 1/2 inch on both the top and the bottom, and then you can go ahead and sew your placement stitch to hold it in place. I am going to do some trimming of our fabric 7, and inside the block here you're going to want to trim it to like 1/4 inch seam right there. Step 5, you're going to need your little square of fabric 4, and you're just going to lay it right side up in about the same area that we just trimmed fabric 7, and you're just going to make sure that area is covered completely. And then with the water soluble thread, we're going to sew tack down stitches. Make sure your fabric stays smooth. Now what we need to do is we are going to trim close to the stitching right here where fabric 4 meets fabric 7. So I have my little hoop scissors minis to trim this. Next step is we are going to add our flange, and this is optional. You can just skip right past this and go to the next step if you choose to, but if you want just a little extra oomph or something extra interesting in your quilt, I would definitely go with the flange. One of the items that you will need with that is you will need, it's called Roxanne glue basted, temporary basting glue, or you could use a product called Wonder Tape, which is a double-sided water-soluble tape. It comes about 1/4 of an inch thick, and you would just place that right there and then peel off what's left of the Wonder Tape and attach your flange to it. But I'm going to use the glue, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put little tiny dots of glue right on there. I'm going to trim the end of this off, and basically your flange that you have a folded edge, the folded edge of the flange, you're going to want it to just cover up that inside line of stitching that is there. So we're going to glue that down so it doesn't move. So I'm going to add my little glue dots. I never thought I'd be sewing with glue, but this stuff is wonderful. And you can cut your flange ahead of time if you want to. Just make sure you have about 1/2 inch extending off the edge of your block. In here is actually going to be a seam, so I'm going to extend that side to about 1/4 inch past the tack down stitch, and then line the folded edge up with that stitching. And I have a little bit of glue sticking out. That's fine, I'll just wipe it off. It is a temporary glue and it dries very fast, so after just a few seconds I can go ahead and take this to the machine and it'll sew a tack down stitch, and we're still going to use water soluble thread for that step. Okay, so I'm at the machine and I have my flange glued down. I'm on step 6, and I'm just going to tack that flange down more permanently with some water soluble thread. And as you can see, it's stitched twice over that. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take my hoop scissors mini and I'm going to trim right up close to the stitching. Okay, I have my flange trimmed right up to the stitching, and I put thread in the needle that matches my fabric 4, which is my light purple, and the machine will sew a satin stitch. Step 8, you're going to take your strip of fabric 1 or fabric 2, depending on if it's 15-1 or 15-2, so your instructions will tell you which one. I'm using fabric 2 because this is block 15-1. I'm going to lay it right sides down. And well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that after I have it flipped, that my corners, the top and bottom corners, are sufficiently covered. And then I'm going to take it and flip it so the right sides are together again. That way I know that after I sew the seam, everything will be covered like it should be. And I will just be placing this. You know what I forgot to do was trim my blue fabric that's up here. That should have been trimmed a scant 1/4 inch up here at the top. Now I have something to line up this piece of fabric with. And so just line it up put your neutral thread in the machine and go ahead and sew a seam. For step 9, you're going to flip your fabric right side up and smooth it out and finger press it. You will put water-soluble thread in the needle only, and the machine will sew a tack down. Just keep the fabric smooth so it sews out and tacks down smoothly. Step 10 is the step where you would add your backing fabric to the back of the hoop. So you would take your hoop off the machine, leave everything in the hoop, and add your backing fabric to the back. And then with water-soluble thread still in the needle, you would sew a tack down to hold the backing fabric to the back. I chose to join my blocks differently and add the backing fabric after a group of them have been sewn together. So I am going to skip step 10 on to step 11, where it's going to do some quilting. Now, if you do have your backing fabric on, you're going to want to match your bobbin thread with your needle thread. But if you're doing what I'm doing, you can continue with just your embroidery bobbin thread. The other thing you'll want to do is, if your machine has an automatic thread cutter, you're going to want to turn it off at this point. And if you have your back on, you're also going to want to do needle down, needle up, to bring that bobbin thread to the top. Now, I don't have that, so I actually don't have to do that step. I can just begin sewing, and you can too. If you don't have a back on, then just start sewing the quilting. So here we go. And I'll usually just take a couple stitches and then cut that thread tail. Step 12, you're going to put thread in the needle that matches your fabric 7, and in the bobbin if you have your backing on. If you don't, then you can just go ahead and hit start and use that embroidery bobbin thread. And it's just going to do some more quilting. And for step 13, you're going to put thread in the needle that matches your fabric 2. And in the bobbin, only if you have, also in the bobbin, if you have backing fabric on. I don't, so I can just hit start and get sewing. So this is going to sew some quilting, and this is our final step in this block. So you will also make a 15-2 block and then sew the 2 together, and I'll show you how in the next clip. Once you have your blocks 15-1 and 15-2 all stitched out and trimmed like the instructions say, which is using the metal edge of the trimmer by George on all 3 sides of both pieces, then it is time to join them together. So you will just put the right sides together and we will begin pinning. Now when you pin your blocks, and this is true for all of our blocks, in order to get them pinned together without things shifting or moving, we have a specific way to pin. And the first thing you will do is you will find the very corner of your block, or in this case this block happens to be a triangle, and also the very corner stitch of the block you're going to sew it to. And you will just drop a pin in there and leave it. Don't put the pin back through there yet. We're just marking it so that it is lined up properly. We'll do the same thing for this corner. Line it up on the joining block. We're just going to leave those pins in there. Now we're going to take that first pin that's all lined up, and we're going to pin a second pin right next to it. But we're going to start by pinning in the seam allowance and then back through the block. And by doing it that way, it prevents it from shifting and it not being sewn together properly. So I'll go ahead and take this pin out and go down to this side where I have it marked. And again, I'm going to put my pin in through the seam allowance, just the seam allowance and then back through the block. And then I can take this pin out. And if there are any match points in here, I don't believe there is in this block, but if there are any match points, you will then just drop a pin straight through right on the match point and then drop a pin right next to it. But since I don't have that, I am just going to find where approximately the center is. I'm going to put my pin in right on that basting stitch, and then I'm going to check to make sure it went through right on the basting stitch on the other one, and it appears that it did. Then I can take my second pin. The pins you leave in there will always be the pins that go through the seam allowance, just through the fabric, and then back through the block. So you might want to maybe, I'll put another one in here. I'll add a couple more. Right through the basting stitch or a match point if you have one. And then I'll go ahead and put a pin in the seam allowance and then back through the block. And then take that one out. Just do one more. Right on the basting stitch. On both blocks. If it landed in the right spot, great. If not, make an adjustment. And then take your other pin right next to it in the seam allowance or just the fabric, and then back through the block. So I'm ready to sew this together. So at the machine, I'm going to sew a seam that's right on the basting stitch. And I'm just going to use a regular sewing thread, like an Aurifil or whatever sewing thread you have, both in the needle and the bobbin, something neutral or that matches both of your fabrics that you see here. And I'll be back and we'll take a look at it. Okay, I have my 15-1 and 15-2 all sewn together, and that's what it looks like as a whole. The next thing you will do is you will need to press it, and what I suggest you do is I always press just the edge of the seam, but not too far over, because you don't want to press on the wool. If you press on the wool, you'll kind of lose the whole purpose of having the wool, because it will get flattened by the iron. But just with your iron, press right on the seam. You don't have to go in very far to do that. And then this is a strip stick, and there's other things you can use too, but just use something like a rolling pin. But you use something to put your block on something like this in order to be able to not press down on the whole thing. We want contact with the iron just to be on the seam, and then you can press the seam with your iron to one side, and you have minimal contact with that wool so it can keep its shape. So there is our block 15 all ready to go. So that's it for block 15, and we'll see you on the next video. Thank you for watching.